The State of Crypto is presented by Tron, connecting the world to the power of cryptocurrency.
Finance ministers from 27 member states voted in favor of MiCA today, giving the green light for the highly anticipated markets in crypto assets regulation in the EU and beyond. Our next guest is Laura Douglas, Senior Associate at Clifford Chance. Laura, welcome.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. Now, you're based in London and focus on regulatory policy development. What does establishing this regulatory framework mean for the bloc? We know that the UK is not part of the European Union, but you're very close, and I know that you work very closely with firms that this will affect. So tell us about what this means.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, MiCA is really a game changer for the crypto industry, certainly in the European Union member states, because it will introduce a sort of a pan-European licensing and really comprehensive regulatory regime. And yes, it takes a lot of inspiration from the existing financial services regulatory framework. But at the same time, there are nuances for crypto. So looking, for example, at particular rules for asset reference tokens, e-money tokens. And I think really, it's about, I think, having that sort of common regulatory framework is going to be really important for businesses to be able to access the UK market. And although there's going to be a big, I think, a learning curve and an implementation that needs to be done, the benefit then is to be able to access all 27 member states through the passport.
Yeah, it's quite an amazing accomplishment when you think about it that, 27 member states were able to agree on something. We're here in the US, where like one country is not able to agree on anything really. What do you think are some of the specific lessons that MiCA might have for, other countries? I mean, are there sort of like things that MiCA are doing that are directly applicable to other places? Other countries around the world might say like, hey, they're doing that. That's a good idea. Let's incorporate that into our regulatory framework.
Yeah, so I think there is a sense in which MiCA is quite timely and actually needed by the industry. And if you think, about, for example, some of the challenges that crypto firms have had in finding banks that will service them, and some of the nervousness that there's been around that, and recent events with SVB, Silvergate, etc. Actually, sort of, from that perspective, regulation can be a very good thing for the industry to sort of, be that stamp, that badge of, we have rules that apply to us, we're complying with them. And then, having that pathway for firms to enter into the regulatory regime. So I think that kind of, setting out that path towards kind of supporting the industry to mature and to kind of get to grips with regulation, I think is quite an important element to what we're seeing with MiCA. And perhaps partly for that reason, I mean, I wonder if the EU sort of, there was a sweet spot in kind of the what's happened in the crypto industry over the last months, that MiCA was agreed, and then obviously there's been sign off more recently, but certainly I think firms are looking towards having that kind of badge of being regulated, and having that status.
How does the EU regime compare to what's happening in the UK right now?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of similarities. The EU regime is obviously further advanced because we've got the final text of MiCA. That's not to say that there isn't more to come. Actually, a lot of the detail from MiCA will be fleshed out in technical standards. The UK is a little bit further behind. So we had earlier this year a consultation from the UK Treasury on its proposed regulatory regime, introducing a new licensing regime for crypto asset service providers in the UK. A lot of similarities there with MiCA in terms of taking some inspiration from the kinds of activities that would be regulated. But I think there are still questions. The UK consultation was a bit more high level, and so a lot of the details, including the territorial scope, some of the definitions around carve out, will NFTs be in or out? Those kinds of questions still need to be answered for the UK.
Do you think we're going to see a lot of crypto companies flocking to Europe? I mean, it's getting increasingly competitive out there. You have Hong Kong, Singapore, a lot of relatively crypto-friendly jurisdictions, but Europe is now kind of like getting into the game, right? Do you think we're going to see a lot of exchanges or just, an influx of talent to Europe?
Yeah, I think we are seeing already a number of firms sort of positioning themselves ready for MiCA. So one of the things that MiCA does is that it has a particular regime, and there are sort of some optionalities for member states there as well, but around kind of grandfathering firms in or providing a smooth transition from, for existing firms that operate in the EU, to give them either longer to get licensed under MiCA or potentially sort of a more streamlined licensing process. And so that's what we're seeing a lot of firms, exchanges, etc., doing already, is looking at how can they potentially benefit from that grandfathering transitional regime.
So the share of VC investments in European projects has 10 times in the last quarter. We have a little graphic that we'll show on the screen in just a moment. How should international funds, international firms be thinking about working with EU firms?
Yeah, so I think actually one of the interesting things about MiCA is its territorial scope. And actually, if you want to market, if you want to be able to promote your firm, your products, your services in the EU, effectively you kind of have to be in the EU, and you're going to need to be licensed under MiCA. And so actually there's a huge question of do you invest directly, set up an entity, get licensed? Do you maybe sort of go for acquisitions? There are sort of all sorts of strategic questions there, but certainly, the EU is obviously a huge market. And so I think we're really seeing firms, look at what are their plans to be in the EU to actively engage with customers in the EU, and effectively that means engaging with MiCA.
I want to switch gears here. I know that your firm is part of the Digital Pound Foundation. What is the outlook on CBDCs in the UK?
So it's an interesting question, because the UK's, the Bank of England is still very careful to say, look, we haven't made a decision on whether or not to go ahead with a UK CBDC, so digital pound. But the Bank of England is consulting, so it's looking particularly at a retail CBDC, so a CBDC where end users would include, ordinary citizens, businesses, not just big financial institutions that have access to central bank accounts today. So that consultation is ongoing. It closes later this summer, and it's really, gathering feedback on practical, technical questions. I think there are still a lot of legal questions to be answered. What's the legal framework going to be? How's the governance going to work? All of those kinds of things. As I say, the Bank of England hasn't actually sort of, pressed the button to say we're definitely going ahead. But what they are doing is kind of laying the groundwork to say, if we go ahead, this is what it would look like. I think one of the really interesting questions for the industry is how is the private sector potentially going to partner or interact, act as intermediaries, because the Bank of England isn't going to sort of, become your kind of customer services hotline if you've got a problem with your CBDC. That's kind of going to be a role for the industry. So I think that's one of the really interesting things to see how that plays out and develops.
Laura, do you think that they'll move ahead with it?
So I think there will be a CBDC in some form. I think, it's a question of timing, and I do think there needs to be, careful thought given to the use cases. I think we probably will get there. But actually, to some extent, some of the really interesting projects that we're seeing are often in the wholesale space, and how could potentially a CBDC be used, for payments legs of, security tokens or, kind of DLT-enabled capital markets, etc., which is less of the Bank of England's focus today. but obviously a lot of the work they're doing now would presumably kind of translate across. And so I think it's one to watch this space. I think we will see a CBDC, although possibly other jurisdictions may sort of, I think probably are a little bit further ahead at the moment. So yeah, it's definitely one to watch.
All right, Laura, thank you very much for joining us this morning. That was Laura Douglas, Senior Associate at Clifford Chance.